From the beginning of history, from Moses to Muhammad, prophets, artists and madmen have claimed they heard the voice of God, the Muse, or the devil telling them what to do.
In the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, a whole line of prophets who start off their missions by hearing the voice of God calling them. Islam would hold that the Quran is literally dictated by God through the voice of an angel. The Buddha is achieving enlightenment by following the voices he hears and the impulses he receives. There seems to be a common element of the spiritual life, that we are affected and led by voices, by influences beyond ourselves.
But in the modern world, do we really believe Mother Teresa, that she heard the voice of Jesus telling her to care for the poor? Did George Bush, as has been alleged, really hear the voice of God telling him to invade Iraq?
This hearing of voices hits people at a level that can really change their own lives. And if they are people who become influential, it won't simply have changed their own lives, it will have changed the lives of nations. You can simply dismiss any talk of hearing voices out of hand. And I think if you do that, you're missing out on a major area of people's life experience.
So what are the voices in our head? Can science explain how the prophets heard the voice of God? Once, our world was filled with gods and demons, and we accepted that they spoke to us. Then the modern world distanced us from that belief. But for some people, those voices are still heard as very real.
It was as if my mind had gone out of control. I was terrified. And not long after I realized that it was Satan planting thoughts in my mind, I began to feel pressure in my abdomen and concluded that he was trying to possess me. He said I was his, that he had conquered me and there was nothing that I could do to prevent it, which simply added a lot more terror.
So long as we believed in outside spirits, then we could believe someone who said they heard a voice in their head that was not them.
In a medieval worldview, the human being is a battlefield. God is working through the good spirits, and Satan is working through the evil spirits.
He could be sweet, he could be cruel, he could be tempting, he could be sarcastic, he could be bitter. Sometimes his voice sounded old, and sometimes it sounded young.
The modern world is no longer willing to accept voices as outside, supernatural entities. Instead, they are understood as creations of our own minds, whose strings, even without knowing it, we are pulling.
After having been taught for 13 years that Satan was after me all the time, trying to take me to hell, when I told my parents about it, their response was that I was mentally ill.
What would once have been understood as spiritual and meaningful is now written off as meaningless and madness.
Traditional psychiatry would say that if you hear a voice, you are unwell. Voices were seen as kind of spasms of the nervous system. They were just evidence that the brain wasn't working properly.
By the time the 20th century came along and we believed in the brain and physical causality for everything in the mind, the suggestion was that the sort of experiences that the mad people were having was simply not understandable. It was like random activity happening in the brain which didn't mean anything.
The notion that hearing voices is madness ignores the long tradition in the arts of hearing the voice of the muse. Great artists, such as Mozart and Blake, weren't driven mad by the voices they heard, but inspired by them. John Lill is one of the greatest pianists of his generation and a voice hearer.
It was in Moscow. It was in the Tchaikovsky competition, which they held every 4 years, and they still do. I was 20. Yeah, I was a spotty-faced brat of 25 or 26, I think. But I was in Moscow. I was just about to play the final round the next day, and I'd been practicing pretty hard. And I was aware of this figure. It was in old-fashioned dress, this gentleman, and there's no question that that figure was there. There was this smile and this very loud bellow laugh. I recognized this was a very great composer, judging by the face. And I thought perhaps I'd been working too hard, I was seeing something. But it was too real for that. It really was solid and very purposeful, saying, "You're going to win tomorrow." So I thought, it's obviously a daydream, but I thought to myself, if this happens, I've got to rethink this. And they gave me first prize. So I rethought it and realized it really was absolutely true, absolutely real. But let me tell you, that's one of thousands of experiences I've received before and since.
If it were just artists who heard voices, psychiatry could perhaps write it off to poetic license. But people such as Professor Chatelain make this much more difficult to do. Françoise Chatelain is one of France's most respected and gifted mathematicians, and she too has heard a voice in her head.
One night, I was sleeping, I was really asleep, and then there was a voice which kept repeating the same word to me. It was just one word. It was dualité, dualité. It kept repeating, maybe for 10 minutes. It kept repeating dualité, dualité. I take a piece of paper and I begin to sketch whatever comes to my mind. And each night they would give me enough information for the next day to put it on paper. And that it was all clear to me. And I understood and the role of analysis, geometry, arithmetic, all of that, how it's all combined.
And you didn't start to think, perhaps I'm just losing my mind, that the slates have started to slip?
Not at that moment. When you think you understand, you understand.
Did they make sense?
Yes, of course. Perfect sense. Complete sense.
But it could have been gibberish. It could have just been that your mind was playing tricks on you.
But I was not the target of someone trying to play tricks on me. What my voices helped me to do was to open a new door on the way to perceive numbers in a different role than the understanding that most mathematicians have about numbers.
Chatelin is no prophet, but her work, inspired by her voices, has been professionally reviewed and published. With such examples, can we any longer dismiss voices as mere madness? Science is having to take voices seriously, but can it explain how such voices came to be? If we do want to take seriously the idea that there are voices of inspiration, how then are we to deal with the voices of madness?
But they would be really in your face. It's almost like they're there and there and there, invading that personal space as well as hearing them. So you get a sense that they're right up against you, almost. It's almost like you can feel them if you wanted to. And I'd literally be in a corner, not able to move, because I would have this massive lot of abuse being hurled at me. And never understanding why at that time was the scary bit.
The problem was, according to psychiatry, there was no reason why. If the voices were no more than creations of a broken mind torturing itself, why would you listen to them?
Most nurses had been trained that you didn't get into discussion about a voice with a person because it would reinforce it. I came out of psychiatry after 10 years of being a patient, where I came out with less than I went in with. And every time you tried to talk to somebody about it, you would say to a nurse, look, my voices are really bad, I need to talk to you. They would say, okay, Ron, let's play Scrabble, or let's make a cup of tea. They would never sit down and focus on the voices with you.
Unlike science, the Church has always believed voices could have real meaning and therefore be worth listening to.
How do you approach somebody who is claiming to have heard a voice? Do you say there's something real going on here? I think that you need to start from a point where there is something going on in this person, and you're trying to understand it, and you're also trying to deal with it. It's probably not going to be the best way to address what they're saying, simply to say, do you not realize you're barking mad? You need to acknowledge there is something real and meaningful and intense going on for them.
Yet this is precisely what psychiatric science has never been able to do. Until a revolution began here, in Holland, with one voice hearer called Patsy Hager.
My vision was that I wasn't mentally ill, I just heard voices, that's all. And I had been hospitalized before and given drugs which didn't take the voices away. I heard about 20 voices. They gave me all kinds of commands and were very nasty. And they controlled my life. I thought they were almighty gods. It was a very difficult period in my life, yes.
What Patsy did was to challenge her doctor, Marius Romme, to take her voices seriously. Today, Romme and his partner Sandra Escher are world authorities on voice hearing.
Patsy said, you never ask or help me about how to cope with the voices. These voices are troubling me, and you only talk about them as if it is a symptom, which doesn't help.
They were very real because I could hear them very clearly, and I said to him sometimes, why do you believe in a God? You never hear, you never see, you take that seriously, why don't you take me seriously? Because I can hear them.
I hear these voices and you don't believe me. So that I found inadequate, in fact. Yeah. So from that time I thought, now perhaps we'll explore how realistic these voices are.
From that moment on, Marius believed in my voices, and we have been working very hard to cope with them. Not to let them disappear, because that's not possible. But I worked with him to see how I could cope with them without being mentally ill.
Inspired by Patsy, Rom and Escher's breakthrough was realizing voices, even those traditionally labeled as mad, can have a coherent reality.
I think the most important thing is that you accept what the voice hearer says and then look with get more idea yourself about the theory that's behind it and not exclude it from.
Yeah, but it's also dangerous because in psychiatry you see it as a symptom of an illness, while in reality it's also a strategy to cope with your life. And it is in psychiatry it has no meaning, while in reality it's full of meaning.
If you accept that voices are real and meaningful, then it opens the possibility that voices might have different characters, some good, some evil. A possibility the Church has long believed.
Once you've got a recognition or an acknowledgement that there are forces outside us that have some sort of influence on us, then you've got the questions arise of how do you decide which of these are worth going along with and which aren't? How can you get misled by them? Those kind of questions become, and then you have the science of discernment.
Questions which science is only starting to think about, the Church has considered for centuries. Saint Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, was a voice hearer who heard the voice of God and wrote a treatise called On the Discernment of Spirits.
He has a set of what he calls rules for discernment, guidelines that say something like, for instance, if you are basically leading a godly moral life, he says that the influence of the good spirit, the good voice, will be one which is gentle, and he talks about it being like water seeping into a sponge. The influence of a bad spirit, a voice that's likely to be leading you astray, is going to be jarring, like water falling onto a tile or a rock, a sort of splashing, a violence to it. There's a recognition that they can tie in very closely with what much psychology is saying about how human beings work and how human beings are influenced.
The argument that it is right to treat voices as having their own characters, some good, some evil, is that for the first time, it allows voice hearers to understand them.
I suppose that was one of the turning points in my life, realising that voices had real meaning, that they were not meaningless, that they were not created just from your imagination, but they were actually part of your lived experience. And I think once you got an understanding that the voices were part of you, then the second understanding came that meant you could do something about it.
You can have your own point of view. You can disagree with the voices or agree with the voices. And we saw that it was helpful for someone if the voices were made more concrete into a person.
So hearing voices, in one sense, is neither here nor there. It's what you do with that experience that determines, I guess, whether you become a patient or a saint.
For some voice hearers, like Robin Cunningham, coping with his voices meant creating an entire mental landscape in which he was able to confront them.
My conceptualization of this in my own mind was that there was an inner core of my mind, what I called my internal mind. I thought of my inner mind as sort of a citadel. That was intended to be the safe haven. And the idea was to isolate myself in this inner circle. It was a place, I perceived it as a place where I could work out all these things that were happening and make sense of it and understand it. But that's what I wanted it to be. I wanted the inner mind to be a sanctuary. I perceived my mind to split right then and there. And outside of that was my outer mind. The outer circle of my mind was intended to try to deal with the outside world. The outer mind included all the other aspects of my relationship with the rest of the world. I was able to banish demons and what they had to say and use the outer portion of my mind to protect the inner portion so I could work out my dilemma.
Cunningham, though he still occasionally hears his voices, has been a successful Wall Street investment banker. Examples like this lead to the startling conclusion that sane people may hear voices. And it was exactly this that Roman Escher discovered.
It was very emotional for a lot of people. In the years to follow, we had so many telephone calls from people all over Holland who heard about our work, and then people who said, I've never been able to talk about it, and that you accept the voice as real is so important for me.
What is the prevalence in the normal population of hearing voices?
2 to 4%.
Depends on the studies.
That's a lot.
All age groups, no differences.
And only a third of them becomes patients.
4% of the British population, of 60 million, is 2.4 million people who may have heard a voice. And up to 1.5 million of them would be normal and untroubled by their voices.
If people hear voices and do not become ill, then hearing voices in itself is not a symptom of an illness.
So now, according to Roman Escher, whatever voices are, we can no longer dismiss them simply as products of broken minds, because they are produced by sane minds as well. So what are the voices in our head? Having accepted the reality of voices, psychologists now have to explain them, and there are familiar brain functions which point the way.
The term inner speech is used by psychologists to refer to something which I think everybody's familiar with, really, which is this inner dialogue which we have. I mean, most of us spend much of our waking hours thinking about things, talking to ourselves about things. And in adulthood, that's what we do most of the time. You know, there used to be the old joke that talking to yourself was the first sign of insanity. That's not true. If anything, it's the first sign of sanity, actually. It's a perfectly normal process, and we use it to regulate our behaviour, to plan, to think, and so on. Now, there is obviously a connection between this process and the kind of experiences that voice hearers have.
In inner speech, we know we are pulling the strings, but in voice hearing, the voices seem to have a will of their own. The key to both, some mind scientists think, may come from how the mind uses what we learn about the world to build mental models in order to simulate places and people and things.
The idea that there are models in our heads applies everywhere. So it's not just to do with other people. So I have a model in my head at the moment of what this room is like, and I would know roughly how I would have to move to grab that head or something like that. And this is a so-called generative model version of how the brain works. And so there's the idea that because you've got a little model of someone inside your head, you can simulate them, you can predict what they are going to do next.
And indeed, we couldn't function as human beings without having something like that, without being able to generate models of what other people do and what other people are likely to say to us. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between my friend and my foe unless I could have some kind of internal model which would predict what that person would say.
To be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and hear what they might be thinking about a situation inside your own mind gives you a purchase on social situations which you wouldn't have if you didn't have that empathic ability.
For most of us, these models operate silently deep in our subconscious. But for some people, at some times, they may actually speak and be the voices that people hear.
One of the questions is under what circumstances do you get this blurring of the real and the imaginary? Does the imaginary voice achieve the intensity and the richness that encourages you to confuse whether it's imaginary or real? And the answer seems to be under conditions of stress. Something happens in the brain which stop the brain being able to make that distinction as clearly as it usually does, or as reliably as it usually does. It's almost as if the brain has got so much else to cope with, whether it's, an intense problem-solving session or bereavement or battle or whatever it may be. These seem to be the prototypical circumstances, not always by any manner of means, but where there's a heightened likelihood of hearing voices.
So on this evidence, voices may be real and coherent, exactly as voice hearers claim. They exist in our minds as the products of models built up. Which brings us to the most critical claim voice hearers make, that they do not control their voices, do not pull their strings. That the voices can come to life and take on a will of their own.
I used to think all my voices came from me and only me. Now I'm not so sure. I still think the voice I call teacher, and I talk with that voice about things when I'm thinking about where I'm going, which direction I'm going in. So I quite often see that voice as autonomous.
They may have been the product of the models in my mind, but I could not control them. I just could not. They had a life of their own. They said things and put thoughts in my mind that were, I considered, very dangerous. If I could have controlled them, I would have.
And some mind scientists, like Guy Claxton, think that these claims may be true, and point to the experiences of writers who say they actually hear the characters speak to them as the clue.
Creative people, writers, dramatists, poets, songmakers, are forever talking about how their voices take over. They become real. They have a life of their own. I didn't write it, or my characters continually surprised me, is something that you hear novelists or dramatists saying all the time. I thought the story was going in this way, but they didn't want it. They didn't want it to go that way.
Hilary Mantel is one of those writers who claims to have had the experience of hearing her characters speaking to her as independent voices.
I wrote a book called The Giant O'Brien, and it was about an 18th century Irish giant. But when I sat down to write it, what I heard were some voices that seemed to be coming from a cave, from the back of an unlit space. And these voices weren't even speaking English. They were speaking Irish. It was those voices that carried me through the book. And I don't have the experience of that novel, The Giant O'Brien, as being written by me. I have the experience of it being listened to by me and then appearing on the computer screen. But then you do come to this question of, but how can I know all that? How can I seem to produce a character who acts in a way that is independent from me and foreign to me? Where did these thoughts come from?
And for Mantell, the answer fits very closely with the model-making hypothesis.
What happens is that you create a character so thoroughly and from such a deep place, and you look for a deep place in the character to move from. So what you have then is a working model perfect in all its parts, and you can take it out of the situation you first put it in and put it into any situation. And what you're trying to create is the illusion that your character has free will, that your character is not an automaton directed by you, but that your character has a life of its own.
Does this experience of writers such as Mantell, of building up a model which eventually comes to life, give us an insight into hearing spiritual voices?
So you start off with a very familiar story, the nativity of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, the Christmas crib scene. In the first part of the prayer, you're building up that picture before your mind's eye. You're then letting the details of that picture speak to you, and possibly even the people in that picture speak to you. In some kinds of imaginative scene, you'd want to say afterwards, and some kinds of people, I think, too, would want to say, well, simply, that came to me in my imagination. If it's been a more vivid time of prayer, and or other types of people temperamentally, will be quite happy to say, God spoke to me in that scene and said, called me to, invited me to, pointed out to me. I think that's true. I don't think there's a hard and fast division between some sense of God speaking and what's going on in my own imagination.
So whether built up through prayer or the author's craft, this kind of model that has a life and will of its own may be exactly what voices are.
The model of your father, the marionette of your father, is, in the jargon would be called self-organizing. So once you set up the system with all the information that you put into it, it is now to some extent independent and is pulling your strings. So in that sense, there are things happening in my brain that this I is not doing.
Such a model would then be far more than a mere puppet. It would have a life and a mind independent of us, and be able to speak to us exactly as voice hearers say.
You become their creatures. That's the thing. You're their creature. They're not your creatures. Maybe you're their puppet. You've got to be willing to surrender your mind and your attention and your thoughts to what they want to tell you, and then to make use of what they want to tell you to make your book. So what you're doing is allowing a new consciousness to emerge.
If part of how the human mind works is to create voices in our head that live and think independently of us, could this also be the mechanism of how the prophets heard the voice of God? So it may be that the voices that speak to some of us in our head can have a life and opinions of their own. But if they could go a step further and actually think creatively for themselves, then they would be able to tell us things we had not thought of, reveal truths we had never known. Could this explain how the prophets heard the voice of revelation?
The fact that the voice can have opinions that are directly opposed to mine would not be a problem at all, because I can have models of people in my head with opinions that are directly opposed to mine. The interesting question is the claim that the voice told them something that they didn't know. And then I would say it's not magic. It's not parapsychology. It's not that stuff out there is somehow getting into their heads that wasn't there before. I would say we are not simply passive receivers of information or storers of information. There are all sorts of things going on in our brains all the time. It's reorganizing itself. Most recently is the idea of the brain as a system that simulates things, like predicting the weather from what you know so far.
Well, imagine if you're a scientist trying to investigate the weather. This is what scientists do, investigating the weather. They can build in the model virtual weather systems. And then they run the model, and then they see what happens. And, lo and behold, they discover that it's going to rain next week or something of that sort. It's not like they're controlling everything which is happening in the model. They create the model, and then the model runs itself. It has an autonomy because it's been given that autonomy by the designer of the system.
But is it possible for a model that lives in your head to go beyond voicing its own opinions, to telling you things you never knew?
No, I think that's interesting. I think it is like a weather model. It's like a simulation, and it could come up with something. Although you had all the mechanics to do the simulation, you would never have actually simulated all possible situations. So there might be new things that you've never simulated which would then come out. The system that you've completely determined produces results that you didn't expect.
Such a model would then be a living, thinking creature inside your head, telling you things you might never have realized.
The fact that some of these voices have a mind of their own is their value to me. The model of my mother inside my head doesn't just say to me things that I've really heard my mother say, but they embody the motherness of her, the kinds of things that woman would say. I've built up a dispositional model of that character, not just a kind of filing cabinet of memories that I can pull out and reactivate it, but a constructive model, a creative model, which I could then put back into a new situation, where I could put my character into a new situation. And the essence, the beauty, the power of these voices is that they surprise me, is that they do things that I wouldn't have thought, couldn't have thought, and couldn't have predicted.
This kind of voice of revelation was exactly what Professor Chatelain claims to have heard. Only for her it was the voice of mathematics, not religion. A model in her head, built from everything she knew of mathematics, came to life and began to think profound thoughts of its own, and one day spoke to her and told her things she never knew.
What my voices helped me to do was to open a new door on a way to perceive numbers in a different role than the role which is commonly taught at school and in real life, and the understanding that most mathematicians have about numbers, in a way to open my mind to new ways of looking at the problem. Those voices, in a way, were so startling that it was as if they would say, look, we are going to help you, but you have to be, you have to listen. You have to listen, and you have to be willing to accept our help.
Chatelain has spent her life thinking about maths, building mathematical models in her mind. So for her, the revelations were mathematical. But the prophets and saints spent their lives contemplating the teachings of God. They would have built up a model of God in their minds, which would have spoken to them as the voice of revelation. Could this be how Moses heard the Ten Commandments, or other prophets the word of their God?
I think the interesting thing about the idea of a simulation is that you can, having read the Bible, having used that to build up your model, your simulating machine, when you can now run this machine in new situations which were not present in what you read, and it will tell you the answer.
So the image of Jesus, the image of Gandhi, the image of Zeus that becomes installed in my head can have an enormous power in telling me what I should do, how I should behave. Not only should, but what I might.
For science, the way the mind builds models, which have an immense wisdom of their own, is a way of explaining how the prophets heard the voice of God. But is this enough for believers?
So if you have got a scientific idea of hearing a voice being rooted in people building up models, and those models becoming increasingly real, I think that accords very well with how Ignatius would understand that prayer works over time. Not one-off prayer, but that by day, by month, by year, you are praying. You're approaching the scriptures. You are meeting Christ in those scriptures. And a believer who's doing that over years will be building up a very strong image or model of Christ in their own lives. Christ who speaks to them, Christ who is with them. I think so far so good. It's very much what a scientist would want to say. I think what religion, a religious understanding would add to that is that's how God works. God doesn't need to send an angel with feathers and a long nightie down to whisper in your ear. God works through those models to get across what God wants to say. And as we've said already, the interesting thing is God can surprise you that way. That the model of Christ you have in your head, the Christ who is there for you in prayer, can say something that you didn't expect, can look at you in a way that you never expected at all.
So the theory that the mind builds models might explain how people hear the voice of God. Moses would have built a model from his religious beliefs, which he heard as the voice of his God, a model so extraordinary in its power that it gave us the 10 Commandments. If this is the way we are made, then some may hear the voice of God, others the voice of inspiration. But if we are all capable of hearing it, then the question is whether we are listening.
Unless we cultivate that ability to be quietly respectful of these things that come to us from outside our own preordained sense of sensibleness and rationality and control, unless we have that, we lose so much of our own potential because we literally are deaf to many of the voices through which our brains speak to us.
Take the example of a lake which is swirling around with a bad storm. A little ripple will be completely unnoticed in such circumstances. If that lake is still, completely serene, the smallest ripple will be noticed. And so it is with people's reception of outside assistance. People's lives now are deafeningly loud by the cacophony that surrounds them. How can they be receptive?
And then there is the still small voice, or the range of stiller, smaller voices, maybe voices which represent deeper values, And that can come to you as the voice of God, or it can come to you as your own still small voice inside. But it doesn't come in the hubbub. It doesn't come unless you create the space for yourself to go, yeah, I remember what I really care about.
Voices may be an insight into how our minds work, of how it is some claim to hear the voice of God or inspiration.
When you're writing and you talk about this point where the character begins to speak, this state of being that we call inspiration, what it feels like is absolute elation. It feels like pure joy. It's a sense that everything has fallen into harmony and proportion. It feels as if, for a moment, the casual disharmonies of life have fallen away, and you're in tune, and everything is working together, and it's a moment of such sweetness that I imagine it is intensely like a religious experience.
You're actually breathing in that force, inspiration, in spirit, breath. The imagination becomes illuminated by inspiration. When you can raise yourself so high that you can actually touch fingers with the forces that can only come down to a certain degree. It's an incredible feeling of uplift. You are possessed by a force of infinite good.
If we are built to hear the voices in our head, then some of us may hear the voice of God, the angels, or inspiration, while others will hear the voice of demons and madness.
When I go to sleep at night, and when I wake in the morning, there's that period of a minute to 2 or 3 minutes where you're not quite asleep and you're not quite awake. They do appear then. So are they gone for practical purposes? Yes. In terms of an absolute sense, no. They will always be a part of me.
They're still out there in the woods.
They're still out there in the woods.